Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here with us today and this esteemed panel to talk about issues that are still existing within the garment supply chain in regards to COVID-19. I'd like to thank Remake for inviting me to be a part of this. And for those of you that don't know, my name is Aja Barber. I am a writer and consultant, and my work centers around sustainability and the intersections of sustainability and who is harmed within these supply chains and how do we build a better world. And so for those of you that might not understand the problems, I'm going to let the panelists speak for themselves, but what we saw last year with brands canceling orders has caused enormous problems for people who are already doing some of the most backbreaking labor within this supply chain and not being paid extremely fair for it to begin with. And so this panel is all about communicating what it is that we need to do today to get everyone to a place where people feel like they are being treated fairly so that we can all build a sustainable world where we can rise together. So today with me, I'm going to introduce my panelist. I have Zaki Saleemi, who is the Vice President of Crescent Bahuman, Pakistan's first vertically integrated denim facility and Board of Trustees for Transformers, a coalition advanced ethical and sustainable practices in the denim supply industry. I also have Khalid Mahmood, who is the Director of Labor Education Foundation, a worker rights NGO in Pakistan. I have Scott Nova, the Executive Director of the Worker Rights Consortium, which oversees the COVID-19 fashion tracker. And I have Ayesha Barenblat, who is the founder and CEO of Remake and the co-author of PayUpFashion, which is the hashtag PayUp campaign. And I'm going to give each of our esteemed panelists 1 to 2 minutes for some intro remarks. Please note that all of this is being recorded. And hopefully I will have some information about perhaps in the future we can rewatch it for people who weren't able to make it at this time. So why don't we start with Zaki. Zaki, you have to unmute yourself, Zaki.
It's at 9 o'clock time zone. Thank you, Aja. Thank you for the introduction. Crescent Bahuman, basically, as you mentioned, is the first vertically integrated denim jeans manufacturing. Now we're set up approximately 100 kilometers from the nearest major city. And basically everything's built around a campus life. So we house approximately 3,500 residents of this campus. So we have to take on the responsibility, especially when the pandemic broke out, to manage their daily affairs, everything of the sort, even though the government had us shut down for a month. We were spared the brunt of the pandemic, and I think it had a lot to do with the fact that we didn't have as many clients as some of the larger organizations in manufacturing do. We do approximately 1 million jeans a month and 1.5 million meters of fabric. So we're not that large. I mean, there are entities out there with probably upwards of 30 to 40 clients across the globe. We have approximately on any given day 8 to 10 customers, and one of our key customers was extremely understanding of the situation. However, we did witness, a number of occasions or a number of incidents where our payment terms were independently changed, goods were held. So we did catch the pandemic. We did experience the negative side of the pandemic, and at times we did feel basically that we couldn't change anything about it. And well, I'm happy to say that we are part of the Transformers Foundation, and we feel that certain ways of doing business do need a relook at, and I think that's extremely important. So a year later now, things are in recovering mode, but the fundamentals that did affect us back then still are in the same situation. So Nobody's had had a look at how these contracts are built, how anybody can get away with canceling or changing payment terms independently. So there's a lot open. There's a lot for us to tackle that's on the table at this stage. Thank you, Aja.
Thank you very much, Zaki. I'm going to move on to Khalid Mahmood.
Thank you very much, PayUp campaign and Ayesha and Aja. Labor Education Foundation is a trade union-based labor NGO in Pakistan, and we are working since last 20 years. And we work closely with the trade unions and the workers groups. And of course, the biggest industry in Pakistan is textile and garments. So our also main work is with the textile and garment sector workers. And but besides that, we work with a lot of other sectors as well. Pakistan is a difficult country when it comes to the labor rights situation, and especially if we talk about the freedom of association and the collective bargaining rights for the workers. Pakistan is one of the most difficult countries in the world. And as the textile and garment sector is the most important sector for Pakistan, and it's the biggest export-oriented industry for Pakistan, especially after GSP plus status for Pakistan. The export to Europe has increased a lot under this scheme, and the garment sector is the biggest exporter. So this is in most of the ways very important industry, not only for the Pakistan economy, but also for the employment rate of the workers as well. And then, of course, there are not only men, but there are many women workers involved as well. So there are many dynamics to this industry for the workers. And we try to work in a way that in this difficult situation where not only the trade union rights are under threat in Pakistan, but also the NGO work in Pakistan is also under threat due to certain reasons. And we have to work very closely with the workers, but also we do not want to portray ourselves in a way which is often considered by the employers and the government that we are labeled anti-state or anti-industry, or these kind of labels are there for some of us, but we want to work together, and we want to build a progressive and democratic trade union movement in Pakistan, or in a broader sense, a labor movement in Pakistan, which works for the betterment of not only for the workers, but also the economy of Pakistan.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for that intro. I'll move on to Scott Nova.
Thanks very much, and good to be with you all today. The COVID-19 crisis has laid bare longstanding inequities in the global apparel supply chain. And while apparel brands and retailers are obviously not responsible for the pandemic, they are responsible for the moral and economic realities of the supply chains they've constructed, and they are responsible for their behavior in the face of the crisis. And the supply chains the brands and retailers constructed were defined first and foremost by grossly inadequate sub-poverty wages for garment workers across the world, dating back decades, as a result of which very few garment workers had a single penny of savings on the eve of the crisis, despite working for well-known brands in many cases for years. Indeed, most workers were in debt, having borrowed money simply to buy the necessities their wages don't support. So when the crisis hit, workers had no safety net, no margin for error, and many were forced very quickly into destitution, inability even to feed their families. Then the brands and retailers made things worse by responding to the crisis in many cases by retroactively canceling orders, by which I mean refusing to pay for goods they had asked suppliers and workers to make, and that suppliers and workers indeed had already made, with suppliers in most cases having borrowed the money necessary to buy the fabric and make the products, therefore pushing the economic pain down the supply chain, forcing many suppliers into instant bankruptcy, and causing far more damage in terms of job loss than would otherwise have been the case. Now, fortunately, strong advocacy work by many of the organizations on this call and many others had compelled many brands and retailers to reverse those cancellations, but of course, many did not or were slow to do so. Beyond the order cancellations, what we've seen is brands and retailers taking advantage of the increasing desperation of suppliers as order volume has shrunk to squeeze suppliers on price, to demand larger price concessions than they would in a normal year, and to extend payment terms even further, which is to say to pay suppliers and workers even more slowly for the products that they make, which have further exacerbated the pain of this crisis. Finally, brands and retailers have failed to step up and provide any financial support to the workers who make their clothes. The brands and retailers have benefited enormously from rescue packages and bailouts in the wealthy countries, but they have not taken any steps on their own to provide any support for the workers and their families throughout this crisis. There's no brand or retailer that has contributed substantial sums to supporting garment workers and helping them through the crisis. And so we've seen this yawning gap between the labor rights and human rights rhetoric of brands and retailers and their actual practices in the real world in the face of a humanitarian crisis. And I'm sorry to say, their behavior has been reprehensible with enormous human consequences, and it must change.
Thank you for that summary, Scott. And lastly, I'll move on to Ayesha, who is one of the reasons why I'm here. Thank you so much for being an amazing spearhead of so many, campaigns that really matter.
Thank you so much, Aja, and hello, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Ayesha Barenblat, founder and CEO of Remake. As someone who spent the last 15 years advocating for the rights and dignity of garment makers, as Scott has said, this is and this remains the biggest humanitarian crisis of our lifetime. I think it's important for all press that is listening in to understand that we often talk about the pandemic has led supply chains to be broken, but supply chains are not broken. Supply chains operate exactly how they are meant to be, which is pushing all risk and economic pain from brands onto suppliers and in turn to the world's most vulnerable people. As we think about this being the start of International Women's Month, Women's History Month, a lot of brands are going to be very quick to be talking about campaigning for, the cause marketing they're going to do around how they empower women. But it's important to know that here we are 1 year later, where the predominant people who make our fashion, who bring it to life, as Khalid was stating, happen to be Black and brown women who are consistently underpaid, and in the pandemic are seeing such a sharp decline in their wages that we are starting to have really compelling and terrifying data around hunger, around food insecurity, around fear of workers being trafficked, because often there are very few industries outside of garment in the global south, and these countries are so intrinsically linked to the economies are so intrinsically linked to order demand. And I think the way brands have behaved, as Scott has said, is really this trifecta of, first canceling orders, then demanding discounts, then delaying payments. And the illiquidity that it has caused has really pushed garment workers further and further in peril. We've seen globally a 21% decline in garment wages across the board, versus the top 20 best performing brands have seen an 11% increase in their market cap. And I think as we come into 1 year post the Pay Up campaign and the good work that so many of us did in this on this call to assure that orders were not canceled, that goods were taken, what we're starting to see is a lot of noise about building back better without substance. And I really truly hope that we can dig into that, because from an international financial institutions, from a multilateral standpoint, from an ILO call to action, the amount of money that has been set aside and reached garment workers is really not significant. Meanwhile, the crisis around us when it comes to workers is really deepening. So thank you so much, Aja, and everyone for joining today.
Thank you for that, panelist. I want to turn the question back to Ayesha and Scott. So let's talk about, and some of you have already gotten into this in your intro, but let's get to the real nitty gritty of COVID-19's impact overall. So what was the research showing you at the start of the pandemic, and exactly a year later, where are we with that research? What have we seen the outcome of this crisis?
Well, the most immediate impact was driven by the decision of many brands and retailers to shore up their own finances by reneging on financial obligations to suppliers and workers. And what an analysis of trade data, government trade data for the US and the European consumer markets shows, this is research led by our colleague, Dr. Mark Anner at Pennsylvania State University in the US, showed is a $16 billion disappearance of imports in the initial months of the crisis that can only be explained by the cancellation of orders that workers and suppliers had already produced or were in the process of producing, because given the lead time of orders, the months of trade data that we're talking about can only reflect pre-existing orders. So brands and retailers pulled the rug out from under suppliers economically in a way that made what was always going to be a damaging crisis vastly more damaging for suppliers and workers. Now, there have been a range of subsequent behaviors after that initial crisis of order cancellation, some of which were reinstated, some of which weren't, that we could talk more about, including the price squeeze, delayed payment terms, and so forth. But that, that initial mass retroactive cancellation and refusal to honor financial obligations is both the most destructive act of brands and retailers and the most revealing about the actual ethics of these corporations.
And I would just say, Aja, to add to that, the Clean Clothes Campaign put important study out that where we know from March to May alone, workers had lost $3 billion in legally owed wages. So we were walking into the summer, already we were getting ready for a second lockdown, orders were softening, there were many suppliers that were still waiting for goods to be cleared, and we're working against a really large gap in wages. As I alluded earlier, because we haven't had any of the money coming from a relief standpoint, and frankly, none of the large, most profitable brands putting any money towards severance or relief other than on a case-by-case basis, the impact on the pandemic and the brand purchasing practices has been very swift. So, women are reporting being unable to eat protein, eating one meal instead of two, pulling their children out of school. I think part of, what we are also starting to see, Khalid can speak to more eloquently, is also a increase in state-sponsored violence, a crackdown on unions and organizing, pregnant women being the first to be fired, workers being put on short-term contracts. And I think that's really important, because often when we're asking brands what they're doing from a wages and severance standpoint, they'll say, well, there are no closures in our factories. Workers are doing just fine. But this hiring and firing of workers and putting workers on more precarious contracts means that then suppliers don't have to be paying into social safety nets. And when factories shutter, as they are shuttering, and we're getting early data around that, workers are left really with nothing, because in a lot of these countries, you don't have the types of protections in place. And I think the final thing that really hasn't been covered in media as much is the impact of the virus itself and the shrinking lead times on the health and safety of workers. I think it's important to know that while a lot of auditors continue to shelter in place, while a lot of brand representatives continue to be sheltering in place, workers are expected to go into hot factories, where you're not wanting to wear your mask because you're trying to push out product very quickly. We have seen, masses of outbreaks in Leicester, with LA Apparel in Los Angeles, with Brandex in Sri Lanka. And again, as the virus hits workers who are making our PPE, but also just our sweatbands, there is nothing in terms of relief or medical support. So again, the purchasing practices have had these three very damning impacts on workers. And frankly, us as advocates are very worried. Where's the money? Where's the money from government? Where's the money from brands in particular? And why isn't time of the essence?
Oh, that is a doozy, but I've had these thoughts myself. I mean, we talk about everyone sheltering in place and people are talking about buying sweatpants, buying things, even applauding brands for making masks and PPE, but nobody is actually asking what about the person making that mask and PPE. We can applaud as much as we want, but if somebody is being put at risk to keep the rest of us safe, that doesn't seem like a very fair system. So I want to move to Zaki, and I want Zaki to paint a picture for us of what the pandemic and economic slowdown has meant for your business this year and for the Pakistani sector overall. As a large vertically integrated denim facility, do you think that you're going to weather this storm?
Thank you, Aja. I think for us, we're a campus-built company, so we have to look after our employees. We have been for the last 25 years. We built it ground up on a waterlogged landmass, so there was very, very low employment there. There was no agriculture in that particular area because of it being waterlogged. We had to basically recover the land. So the ethos of Crescent is built around community. It's built around people. So I think we've been better off, first of all, being away from an urban metropolis, as well as everybody went through a shutdown. So everybody had to shut down for a month. That was how the government in Pakistan handled it. And coming out of it, it gave us an opportunity to reset ourselves, looking onto some of the areas where we felt we needed to focus on. So one of the key things that we started to focus on were the SDGs. Women employment was one of the core areas. The other was our sustainability initiatives. So we got a lot of time to introspect, and luckily for us, the business didn't really stop as such, because we do business, around 50% of our business is with one customer who has stood with us in the course of the 23 years they've been operating with us. The rest 50% of the capacity is spread up between 7 to 8 clients across Europe and the US. We did lose capacity. We were operating, one thing we have to understand is capacities basically means seats, and seats means sewing machines means people. So the moment you reduce capacity, that means you're laying off people. You're not functioning at a fiscal optimum. So we had to, let's say, operate at levels of around 70% of our capacity. We're back at, I would say we're back at 100%, but there are planning challenges. I mean, we're not seeing the flow of orders the way we would have seen it pre-pandemic. We can't really say we're post-pandemic because we're all on high alert. We're probably cresting a third wave in Pakistan with probably a UK strain. So there are elements that are keeping us on high alert. But I think for us, there was a lot of introspection. So how do we wanna spend the next 5 to 10 years of our business? What elements do we want to incorporate? How much automation do we want to do? Do we want to scale up our capacities? Because we're seeing a tremendous amount of pressure in terms of, let's say, average FOB prices. And that's something that, generally speaking, in the denim industry, which has been so akin to fashion, we've not seen it as dramatic. People will change sourcing bases if they want to change, let's say, FOB values. So there is a tier that Pakistan operates in when it comes to denim jeans. So generally speaking, you get a better product, you pay a better dollar price on it. But we're seeing pressure in all forms. So one of it is pricing. Others are order sizes. Order sizes are getting revisited, and then the number of styles that are coming in. So the business is getting complex. Now, what we did introspect was how we're gonna actually weather this onslaught of the remnants of the pandemic. So I think we're in a reset as an organization, as a company, but we're putting people indeed in the center. That's it. We're very people focused at Crescent. So, I mean, it's part of our ethos. So there are challenges ahead for most manufacturers, including us. However, I think we will be able to weather it better than others.
I really respect what
I
you
hope
just said
that
about,
answered your question.
yeah, I really respect what you just said about the reset. And I think that that's something that the entire world should be looking at. But in this system, no one more than the brands who have, run their business this way for a long time. Obviously, our planet is going through significant change, not just with COVID-19, but with the impending climate emergency. We all need to be resetting. But I think the people who should be feeling the pressure the most are those who have not paid their bills and found that they've built a castle out of glass. So I noticed that there is a supplier in the audience. Mustafis, we follow each other on Twitter, and I was wondering if you would like to say a few words about how this has affected you as well, because I know that you're a supplier and you do denim. Is there any way possible that we could bring him in? Okay, maybe not. Okay, well, we can come back to that. I've noticed a few familiar names, and I think that it's important to get a lot of different conversations going on about this. I'm going to move on to Khalid, who, what have you been seeing in terms of like this impact on your workers, especially when you're into the pandemic? We hear about what's been happening to workers in Pakistan. Which brands have you been able to engage with, and who has refused to come to the table? Because I know there's some names there.
It's a very difficult question to answer, but I want to give you a picture before COVID. In the garment industry, especially, the patterns of employment in Pakistan are such that majority of the workers are working on piece rate workers or contract workers. So there are recently we did a research and that will come out soon. And we have noticed that prior COVID, there were only 27% workers who could say that they are permanent workers. And all of the others were working on the piece rate workers or daily wages. And then when it comes to the social security, there are only 13% workers in the garment industry. I'm talking about Lahore, Karachi, and Faisalabad, these three big cities, who 13% of the workers only were registered in the social security. So that means, and then when it comes to the wages, it's very, if you calculate the wages for 8 hours of work, you will find very few of the companies, and those few companies are the big companies who are paying minimum wages as per law. And the workers have to work more than 8 hours, and normally it's a 12 hours shift. And they have to work 4 hours of overtime, but they are not paid according to the law of the double rate for the overtime work. So, I mean, and then on top of that, the lack of freedom of association, there are no real unions in the garment industry. There is no real collective bargaining going in the garment industry. And there are a lot of threats and violence as well in some cases against the workers who are trying to organize. During the COVID, we have seen in Karachi and Lahore strikes by the workers after the lockdown. When the factories started working, there were strikes from the workers. In one of the biggest factory in Lahore, workers came out and they were demanding before Eid festival, they were demanding for the payment of the wages. And because before they were refused for even for the payment of the wages before Eid. Same thing happened in Karachi. We have seen violence against workers in Karachi on demanding for the wages after the lockdown, when the work started and before Eid. This all was happening. So when it comes to the brands and the factories management or suppliers here, I mean, their relationship is like what Mr. Zaki is explaining. There are a lot of difficulties after the COVID, but normally they can understand each other. But the problem is that no one is willing to understand the workers' position. No one is willing to understand the labor rights with the labor rights perspective. How, if we want to grow the industry, we have to consider workers as important stakeholder. Crescent Bahuman may be one example where they care about the workers, but I have some, I mean, I have worked a lot with the Crescent Bahuman workers as well in past. I have a different view on that as well, but I mean, Crescent Bahuman may be one of the factories relatively who are taking better care of their workers, but there are a lot of other factories who are, I mean, there are no appointment letters. There is no proof for the workers that they are working in a factory. There are such factories as well. And more than 50% workers after the lockdown started by end of March, and then work resumed in May. But even after that, for 3-4 months, more than 50% workers were not paid fully. They were paid half of the wages, and some of the workers were not asked to come back on the jobs. And workers who were working in cities like Lahore, and they were belonging to other cities, they went back, and they were, it was very difficult for them to come to again to the city when they do not have any job, and they were not asked to come back. Half of the wages were paid for like 3 to 4 months to the workers. And they of course there were lack of orders as well. But what was the responsibility of the employers and the brands? What was the responsibility of the government to just keep the workers in that situation, where, like Scott says, the workers did not have savings so that they could survive for like a week or so. They had to borrow money from the shop. They have to take buy things from the shopkeepers on loan. They had to borrow money from the relatives. And we did distribute some food rations, and we were into the communities of the workers, and we have seen miserable condition of the workers and their families. They had to stop after even after the schools were open. They had to stop their children from going to school because they could not pay fee. There are many workers like that. And there are factories who have thrown workers out of jobs in hundreds. I mean, there is one big factory in Pakistan who have asked more than 3,000 workers to go back. And then after a couple of months, they started recruiting them on contract work. These were permanent workers, and then they asked them to rejoin on contract work. There were workers who were re-employed by the same factory on half of the piece rate. So we have interviewed those workers. We have evidences from those workers. So this was the situation after the work resumed, and still there are a few workers who are fighting their cases in the courts because they were not able to get back their jobs, and they were refused their wages. So I think brands, and not only the brands and the employers in Pakistan, but also I think the government of Pakistan is also fully responsible for this situation of the workers. And national laws should be respected by not only the employers here, but also by the international brands. The international conventions in the same way should be respected by the government, the employers, and the brands. But in countries like Pakistan, we are seeing a different situation when it comes to the labor rights.
Thank you for that. So I guess now is sort of the moment where we move on to talking about solutions. Am I taking any questions yet from do we have any questions
Welcome
yet?
to. I think if people have questions, they can put it in the chat or ask as we go. And we really want to keep
If I can, if I can say one thing, you asked me to name the brands.
Yes.
I mean, I can name the brands. I mean, every big brand is present in Pakistan. You name any big brand around the world, and I mean, you yourself can name. But it is very difficult for me to name the local factories here because of the situation here, and the relationship between these brands and the local factories. It's difficult for us or any trade
I
union
get
leader
it.
as well to name these factories because of the situation here.
I
So
get it
sorry,
completely.
I cannot do that, but you name any big brand in the world and that is present in Pakistan.
That confirms all of my suspicions. And I don't think, today we're talking Pakistan, but obviously we talk about Bangladesh. Even in parts of Europe, we're seeing the same thing. And unfortunately, because there is so much fear of retribution and losing that work, I get why people don't speak up. I totally understand. And, I don't want to put anyone on the spot, but that's also why I'm like, trust no big brand. So if I wanted to just check the chat and see if we have any questions coming in. I've been pretty bad about that. So Aisha, if you have anything that you've seen that I haven't seen, please chime in and let me know.
I think overall people just want to spend a little bit of time wanting to understand, brands are talking a lot, a very big game about building back better. But here we have, labor organizers on the call, Scott and I more from an advocacy standpoint, and Zaki from a manufacturer perspective. And I think it's different, right? So many sustainable fashion panels, conversations have sort of reverted back to no voices from the global south, no voices from producing countries, no people close to the pain of the pandemic and brands purchasing practices, essentially assuring revisionist history when it comes to building back better. And, talking about women's empowerment and circularity and all these magical theories, when fundamentally what we're talking about here is substance. So I'm excited to get into a conversation with our panelists and take questions from journalists on, well, where do we go from here? And what can we actually learn from the way brands have behaved in this pandemic to build back better in a real way. One thing I'll say from a remake standpoint, we were quick to form the PayUpFashion coalition. I know Elizabeth Klein is here on the call. She's an author and journalist that can chime into this conversation. But what was key with the PayUpFashion coalition was that we had Ashila from Stand Up Lanka and Nazma from Awaj Foundation, women who have been promoted off the factory floor to become union leaders in their own right, to author our 7 action point. It is really a worker-centric blueprint. And it's to say the only way for us to build back better is to center workers. Because I've watched the Copenhagen Fashion Summit, I've seen the convenings that brands have done within the call to action, and even thinking about 10 years later after the Sustainable Apparel Coalition came into existence. And for too long, these multi-stakeholder initiatives that are brand paid for and brand led have controlled the conversation, and we have seen very little progress. And so as I think to what needs to happen in the short term, well, there's still a long list of brands that are yet to even pay their bills. Urban Group, Anthropologie, Free the People, love to talk a big game around women's empowerment, still waiting, 13 months later into the pandemic. I think brands need to take a much harder stance when it comes to gender-based violence and the fear of retribution that Khalid was talking about. We have had a coup in Myanmar. We know that there is military junta going door to door, hunting down labor organizers, and brands have been largely complicit and quiet when it comes to Myanmar. In India, we had a rape case in an H&M facility. In Cambodia, it's something Scott and I worked on. There was a worker sewing for Kate Spade and other brands that was jailed for just saying something on Facebook. So keeping workers safe, assuring wages and severance are paid. And then where do we go from here? We know that voluntary initiatives, 30 years of codes of conduct, of auditing has just not gotten us far enough. Which is why, and we'll put it in our chat, our call to action is really focused on, our blueprint is really focused on, it's about living wages, it's about binding agreements, because that's where we have seen true progress, and it's about regulation, which is why we are really excited about the support we've been putting for the Garment Worker Protection Act, Senate Bill 62 here in California, because it would assure minimum wage, but also assure that brands and manufacturers have joint responsibility to assure that workers are paid. And we are gearing up as a coalition of union leaders and advocates for a whole week of action coming up, really about pay her. If brands want to talk about women's empowerment, let's talk about it, but let's talk about it from a wages standpoint.
Yeah, I don't want to see any more feminist t-shirts from anyone who hasn't paid their bills. Cut it out. Okay, so I guess I'll move to Scott because I'm trying to make my way around. As someone who has a lot of experience working with garment worker rights, how has this pandemic changed your thinking, and what do you think that advocates and people within the industry can do? Where should we focus our energy? Just not just within this framework of COVID-19, but how do we end these starvation wages and the unethical practices that we see consistently within the fashion industry?
Well, I think Aisha really hit the nail on the head. The pandemic hasn't changed our thinking, it's reinforced it. It's reinforced our recognition that voluntary solutions, self-promulgated brand codes of conduct, self-regulation by brands of their own supply chains is never going to deliver meaningful labor rights protections for workers. Indeed, all of the brands, labor codes, and monitoring systems, they don't exist to protect workers. They exist to protect the image and reputation of brands by creating the false appearance that brands are doing real work to address labor rights in their supply chains, even as they squeeze suppliers on price, driving down working conditions and wages year after year. We need to move away from this model of voluntary self-regulation toward one defined by enforceable agreements between brands and the unions that represent workers. We've seen that model bring about radical transformation on building safety in Bangladesh under the Bangladesh Accord, so that 2.5 million garment workers are now working in vastly safer factories than they were in 2013 when that program began. That's real change that affects the lives of workers. We need to apply that model of enforceable agreements that obligate brands and retailers to ensure that there are decent conditions in their factories, that obligate brands and retailers to pay a fair price to suppliers. So it is possible for suppliers to maintain decent conditions and good wages. We need those commitments memorialized in enforceable agreements. If we want brands and retailers to behave responsibly, we need to get it in writing.
Thank you for that. And I noticed Elizabeth Klein is here, and I would love to go to Elizabeth because as part of the Pay Up Coalition, I would love to hear a little overview of the reform efforts, if possible.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Aja, and thank you to everyone who's shared so far. My work is in journalism. I'm an author of 2 books on sustainable and ethical fashion. And when brands canceled orders last year, my work really shifted. The short way to describe it is I was horrified by the actions of brands and compelled to act more as an advocate for labor rights. And part of what we are doing with the PayUpFashion Coalition is understanding the various reform ideas that are out there. I think it was Zaki, you said that the fundamentals are the same in the industry. I think that there's this sense of like, why has nothing changed? And it's because as the crisis, the pandemic revealed the labor rights issues in the fashion industry, and the cancellations were kind of an outgrowth of systemic problems. And a lot of people are in fact working on ways to reform the industry. So I wanted to just give a little bit of an overview of what I'm hearing and seeing people work on, because I really do want to convey that there are solutions that are being proposed out there. Scott Nova, you just mentioned the power of binding agreements, and there is a lot of organization happening behind the scenes to advance binding agreements around.
Oh, we lost Elizabeth from Wi-Fi. Elizabeth, you froze.
Oh no. Oh no, oh no. I would love to hear the rest of what she was saying. I felt like she was just getting cooking. Maybe we'll skip ahead to the questions, and when she comes back, we can come back to this if that's okay with everyone. Okay, so the first question I see, I'm just going to do a quick scroll. It's really hard to talk and read questions at the same time. Let's see. Comes from, is it Victoria?
Mm-hmm.
Hi all, thanks very much for this panel. I'd be interested to hear from the panel whether they know of any ongoing cases of suppliers challenging retailers' use of force majeure clauses in canceling orders last year, which I know WRC has done a lot of work on, and whether suppliers are now speaking to retailers about future contracts more fairly distributing risk. I imagine the power imbalance here makes it very tough for suppliers to push on this, but I'd be interested to hear if you know of any ongoing negotiations. Who wants to take that one on?
I think, Scott, you can talk very much from, some of the suppliers you've talked to. I will say very quickly that, we have been in touch with some of the suppliers that were part of the Sears lawsuit. We were actually wondering whether they'd want to be a part of this. And I think part of what we are hearing is really the retribution question. If suppliers are to even contest force majeure or take brands to court, the legal onus is on them. And then it's also a question of threatening future business. And so I think it's really important to understand the power asymmetry here and how in many ways brands have suppliers back against the wall. But I think Scott speaking to the first part of the question, and then I know we have Marzia here from the Transformers Foundation.
And Elizabeth is back with us too. So
Okay.
We can maybe do a little Scott and then go back to Elizabeth, if that's all right.
Yeah.
One of the ways in which you see the power imbalances in the industry manifested is in the payment terms between buyers and suppliers, where brands and retailers don't pay for the products that suppliers produce until months after the workers and suppliers have finished making the products, with the suppliers having to front all of the financial cost of purchasing fabric and making the goods. And if you think about this for a second, what it boils down to is you have suppliers in places like Bangladesh, Pakistan, Vietnam, El Salvador, with revenue of $20 or $30 million a year, subsidizing the cash flow of $20 billion companies like H&M and Gap. It's completely irrational from an economic efficiency standpoint. It's grossly unfair. Why does it exist? It simply exists because the brands and retailers have the power to impose those terms on suppliers. And the result, of course, is a problem of chronic cash flow difficulties for suppliers, resulting in delayed payment of wages, among other consequences for workers. And then, of course, we saw that inequitable payment system taken to its logical conclusion in the decisions of brands and retailers to simply renege on the money they owed to suppliers for orders already produced at the outset of the crisis. Zaki can probably talk from a supplier perspective about the prospects of suppliers potentially pushing back against these kinds of inequities, but a good place to start would be on the issue of payment terms. And Aja, as you put it, to have a reasonable sharing of risk, moving away from a model in which suppliers must incur all of the upfront production cost with no risk to brands and retailers, to one where that risk is reasonably shared and balanced.
I think that's perfect. Elizabeth, you're back with us. Do you want to finish up what you were saying about the outlines for,
Yeah, absolutely. Hopefully my internet's a little bit more stable now. So just really quickly, outside of binding agreements, we are seeing a lot of efforts around reforming purchasing practices and rewriting contracts so that they favor suppliers and strengthen labor rights. So we have people from the Transformers Foundation, which is working on better purchasing practices. I'm not sure if we have anyone from the STAR network, but we're seeing a lot of effort from suppliers in this space. We also have the American Bar Association, a working group of the American Bar Association, has already drafted model contract clauses and buyer codes of conduct that would strengthen contracts between brands and suppliers. The second reform effort is in supply chain regulation or due diligence that would hold companies accountable for what's happening in their supply chain. And the strongest draft legislation around that is coming out of Germany at the moment, and we're supposed to see something drafted across the EU in 2021 as well. So I just wanted to mention a few different things that were going on in the space.
Thank you. That sounds really promising. Ayesha, you mentioned that Marcia wanted to say something
Marzia
about
from Transformers Foundation is here and can talk about ways that suppliers are really coming to take a look at contract clauses in hard ways. So Marzia?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the chance. So Zaki, you mentioned, is a board of trustees of Transformers Foundation. So we are the unified voice for the denim industry, and we say it's ideas for positive change. And what we did last October, we did analyze from the insider's perspective what was going on during the pandemic, and actually 5 months on afterwards, what, yeah, my math is not very good. But yeah, so what we did, we put forward a set of calls to action for every stakeholder or the key stakeholders, but we also did take responsibility on what our actionable and effective solutions could be, and one of which we're working on, and Zaki is one of the first suppliers that endorsed it, is our, let's call it brand's code of conduct. And Ayesha, we were talking during my research about the fact that all brands have a code of conduct that suppliers need to sign, but then it doesn't work the opposite direction. And so this is something that we put forward as a first step, and it, hopefully it's the first step of many. And we're also working on our ethical council for purchasing practices, which would be a separate entity that would hopefully facilitate the arbitration of unethical practices, so that where it's a safe space, let's say more of a business safety space for suppliers to raise their concerns around certain practices. And then I think there's many activities that we do around it to support to support the reset of power imbalance between brands and suppliers. And so another action that we put forward recently was the 2 submissions for policy consultations. One was for the UK and the other one for the EU due diligence, so sustainable corporate governance. Sorry, my internet connection says it's unstable, but if you can still hear me. And yeah, and then we are working in parallel to form a suppliers working group to understand what are the purchasing practices that we need to put in place in order for them to feel safer longer term. And I've tried to summarize everything, but obviously I can put a link to.
The big thing to know is that we're starting to see coalitions come together, right, Aja? Whether through the STAR network, whether through Transformers Foundation, it's really unprecedented. You have to remember that a lot of suppliers are often competitors who are now coming together to say, but wait a minute, in some ways we're being pitted against each other. And what can we do from a contractual standpoint? What can we do from a coming together and really pushing back on this power? I think it's important, though, to acknowledge that this comes with, having value-added garment. If you're a particular type of manufacturer, you can perhaps push back more, versus some of the data we're seeing around closures and the economic pain also sits with the SMEs. So the smaller you are, and I know we have a few small suppliers here in the audience as well, it's a little hard to push back, which is why when journalists often ask us, can we get suppliers to make a comment? It's like, well, speaking to press actually really hurts the business relationship, and that's an important dynamic to understand. I think it would be helpful to talk to Scott a bit more about voluntary initiatives having not worked and why binding agreements is really the path forward. I know there was a question here from Allison.
Yeah, from Allison. That's a good one as well. But can we tag on both of them? Can we talk about that? And then you can just answer Allison's question, which is, the Bangladesh Accord has been challenged by the Bangladesh government. What do panelists think of this? So we'll give Scott both of these.
Sure. Well, I mean, the Bangladesh government has challenged the accord because they've been under pressure from some suppliers who don't like being regulated. And the reality is very few businesses like being regulated. In fact, if you want to test a regulatory system to figure out whether it's working, you want to see suppliers complaining about too much pressure to improve working conditions. And that's exactly what's happened in Bangladesh. Genuine regulation, which has made a vastly safer industry. Some of the more recalcitrant suppliers don't like it, and they're pushing back, and that's unsurprising. It's actually an indication of the success of the program. What we need is to take that model and expand it much more broadly. And look, it's important to note, through all of the years in which workers were dying en masse in garment factories in Bangladesh, the factories they were dying in were producing for major brands and retailers, all of whom had voluntary codes of conduct that were supposed to protect worker safety. And yet those brands and retailers, despite their codes of conduct that obligated them to protect worker safety, despite their much touted monitoring programs, never took meaningful action to address the fire hazards and the structural weaknesses that were leading to mass fatality disasters. This went on for 20 years in Bangladesh. You could not ask for a more definitive, compelling illustration of the utter inability of voluntary self-regulation to protect human rights in global supply chains. What can protect human rights in global supply chains is contractually enforceable commitments from brands and retailers made to unions sitting across the table in a real negotiation. That's what we need to move toward globally. It's also what we need to see at the factory level. As Khalid pointed out, there are very few functioning unions and virtually no collective bargaining agreements in Pakistan, and this is true in most countries across the global apparel industry, again, despite the fact that all of the brands and retailers have codes of conduct that ostensibly protect the right to organize, freedom of association. Yet we don't see genuine respect for that right in most garment factories. If we had enforceable global agreements obligating the brands to treat their suppliers fairly, pay fair prices, only do business with suppliers that meet labor standards, if we had genuine collective bargaining at the workplace level, we would have a radically different garment industry with decent conditions and wages for the tens of millions of workers whose livelihoods depend on this industry.
And I'll just say one thing, Aja, that as we were putting together this press conference, we invited every brand that we are tracking to come sit at the table, if they're about dialogue, have an authentic conversation with us. And not a single brand was willing to come knowing who else the other panelists were. And so I think that's also really important for journalists to understand, why is it that brands continue to hang out in spaces, having these conversations around, if you have no problem with wages and severance, if you are wanting to build back better, then why aren't you here in dialogue with us? And, you know, we promised to keep it amiable and kind, and we couldn't get a single brand to come and join this conversation.
It really says a lot, doesn't it?
That's why there is no freedom of association in the factories. That's why there is no collective bargaining going on in the factories. Scott rightly mentioned that even though that's part of their voluntary agreements, but there is no real respect. And I think the governments also are to be blamed here. But governments also don't want to implement their own labor laws. I mean, what is the role of the government if they do not want to regulate, at least at the minimum level, where the workers have a voice for the collective bargaining? I mean, then why there are labor laws, and if the governments are not ready to implement?
Yeah, why are some of these brands union
doing anything to
busting?
implement?
We hear about the union busting as well. That's not a good thing either. Khalid, I wanted to ask you more about, you know, garment workers' demands and what do you all want to see happen here? Oh no, I think he's frozen.
Wi-Fi in Pakistan, it's like,
Oh, yeah.
I think knowing that we are at the hour, Aja,
Mhm.
maybe we just go to each panelist to say, you know, what's the one thing that we are really focused on? I will say from us as a citizen advocacy collective, you know, we are really focused on assuring that Senate Bill 62 is passed. It's unconscionable that right here in California, we have sweatshop conditions. As I mentioned, we are really galvanizing this month of March around Pay Her and assuring that us as citizens are coming together to push back on, you know, the top 15 brands that have made outsized pandemic profit have yet to put a single cent towards direct relief or any ways to provide solutions to workers. And so there will be ways for citizens to be targeting the brands on Instagram, on social media. We'll have a few COVID safe demonstrations out in stores as well. But I think really from my perspective and having been at this work a long time, the era for talk versus action is over. If we're to learn anything from this crisis, it's to say the only time we have made inroads is when we have better contracts in place, when we are addressing this asymmetry of power, when we have binding agreements. Scott talked about the accord. Also, when we think about gender-based violence and the binding agreement in Lesotho, the only times we've made progress is when something has teeth. And if it doesn't have teeth and it's a lot of conversation, we're simply just going to not come out of this having learned anything.
I noticed that Khalid is back. Do you want to give us a little bit about what you think, garment workers' demands are, and what you all see as something that we can all do to help push things in the right direction? Oh,
I think, may I?
Yes, please, Khalid bhai, we can hear you.
Yeah, okay. I think the major demand from the worker side is, of course, about the wages. There are a lot of complaints about the wages, and there are always problems with the wages. The wages in Pakistan are only about the minimum wages, and that is also a very difficult implement the minimum wages. But I think if some kind of freedom of association and collective bargaining, then the workers can negotiate for somewhat better wages. And then the situation about the working hours and all these kind of things, which are also again linked with the wages. And safety is also a problem at the medium and small enterprises. And there are a lot of brands who are working with the medium and small enterprises. The big factories, I think, have a better conditions when it comes to safety. But there are problems regarding the safety as well. And then I think the gender discrimination, the wages for the women are lower in a way that the women are not really encouraged to take more technical work in the garment industry. And there are few good examples, of course, in Pakistan with big companies where women and men are working together on all kind of levels. But in Lahore, especially, I have seen that there are women, there are factories where women are asked to work for the jobs for which they are paid less as compared to men, or these are already low paid jobs. So I think we need to encourage more, and we see some efforts from the brands as well in this regard. They paste their posters in the factories. There are very good messages, but the problem is that the workers cannot read those messages loudly in the factory. That is the main problem. The workers have no voice, actually. That is the main issue. And there are no sexual harassment committees at the workplace. Pakistan has a law of sexual harassment at the workplace, but in the garment industry, we do not see the sexual harassment committees. There are a lot of verbal abuse going on, and a lot of workers are demanding that the floor supervisors, the managers, which are given free hand by the employers to complete the productions, and when there are a lot of pressure of the production, there are a lot of verbal abuse going on the floor, and the workers cannot really say anything. So I think these working conditions need to be developed in good working conditions, and these are kind of main demands from the workers side.
perfect. So I think I'm going to close things up. I see we have another question, but we're really over time. So I want to go to Zaki, and then I want to go to Scott, and any person on the panel that has some closing remarks to make, jump in.
Okay. No mute. Terrific. All right. So for us, the 8 ethical principles that we signed on to with the Transformers Foundations, we're going to be seeing how they pan out. And I think the key thing to understand for everybody is that a lot of our rational or other organizations response to that should be within their own values as well. So for CBL, I mean, for us, our values are excellence, agility, integrity, harmony, and humility. And when we look at the 8 ethical principles for purchasing that the Transformers Foundation put out, I mean, we're pretty much aligned. So I think alignment is extremely important. And once we do that, I believe it should be easy for the brands to actually come on board as well. There has to be a unified voice, definitely. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Zaki. It's nice to virtually meet you, and I look forward to seeing more of the work that you'll be doing. Scott, I'd like to move to you next.
Yeah, thanks, Aja. I don't have much to add beyond the key points that have been made. We need enforceable agreements to hold brands and retailers accountable, to have real worker rights protections and better wages and conditions in the industry. And we'll only get there through effective publication and advocacy. And I want to thank Ayesha and Remake for bringing us all together today and for the vital advocacy work that organization is doing to bring real change in the industry.
Ayesha, did you have some closing remarks as well?
I would just say that I hope that, as press is telling stories, that we are increasingly assuring that the people in the global south, producing nation suppliers, workers themselves are really central to the stories. If a brand is sending you a greenwash press release, please don't forget the actual people who are dealing with their purchasing practices, and I really appreciate Aja, you taking the time to do this. And I think from our perspective, we are really doubling down on, if anything, we're galvanized from PayUp's success last year and the amount of money that we were able to recoup to continue to push and assure that brands are providing direct relief and that some of this regulatory reform comes down the pipeline. The final thing I'd say is it's telling, we've been literally running GoFundMe accounts, and as citizens, we're able to raise $150,000 for direct relief food for workers last year. We have those GoFundMe accounts again set up. Meanwhile, for all of the IFIs and conversation happening, there's been less than 4 million set aside by the German government. And so one of the things I hope press continues to pay attention to is, where's the money?
Powerful words, powerful words. Thank you everyone for being here today. This was a really illuminating panel. I have learned so much, and I'm someone who I feel follows this closely, but I'm really just floored by all of this. But thank you for showing up, and thank you to the journalists who are here as well. And I just hope in the future that maybe we can just get to a place where this industry that we all love can treat everyone within the supply chain with the fairness that every human deserves. So thank you for being here, and I think it's time to wrap up the room now. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.